The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly. He will suffer from the elders, chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed on the third day and be raised. Then Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. God forbid, Lord. No such thing shall ever happen to you. Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking not as God does, but as humans do." Then Jesus said to the disciples, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. What profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit life? Or who can one give in exchange for their life? For the Son of Man will come with the angels in the Father's glory, and then he will repay all according to their conduct." The Gospel of the Lord.
Over the years, I never remember what I may have said in a place or not. So if you heard this little ditty before, let it go. But some years ago, Archbishop Weekland, when I bumped into him somewhere, he said, "I haven't heard anything bad about you lately. Are you doing your job?" And out of our scriptures today, Jeremiah, what a downer. The poor guy, he's just torn apart, seems to have no sense of the presence of God. He doesn't want to do this prophecy stuff anymore. It just is so painful, but the scripture says it burns within him. He just needs to do it. When God chooses servants, it isn't only the brightest and the whatever you want to think about, but God picks instruments like me and others who maybe at the heart of our own heart and soul, we think we're not worthy. What have I got to offer? And yet over the years, I just have to believe wonderful things have taken place. And I was sort of the channel for that to happen. And that is very humbling. Not always noticing it at the time that that's going on, but it's later, after the experience, whatever it may have been, you say, "Holy cow, I don't believe I did that, or I said that." What a graced, spirit-filled moment it truly was. So those occasions that I'm sure Jeremiah had must have lifted his own spirits too, so that he kept on his task, as difficult as times as it may have been. Now, in the world of Jesus, in his time frame, there was nothing like the future, as we might think of the future. It said our own living today is more linear. We just keep moving along and developing and so on. But in his culture, it was more cyclic. it was like you just went around and around and around. Maybe the closest thing could be a calendar from January 1st to December 31st, and on the calendar are the same events that we celebrate and observe every year, like 52 years of marriage. 53 is around the corner then, right? But for us, we kind of keep going on and on. But in his culture, it was more cyclic. And I recall in our Greek class, when I was still in college days at the seminary, not only were we working on Greek, but great language, though, when you think about it, crazy as that may sound. But we also had a little bit of culture thrown in there. And one of my classmates asked the question of Father York, what about or this, and why did they do this or that? I don't remember the issue anymore, but I do remember his response. Well, the answer is the little Greeks did it because the big Greeks did it. Cyclic. You just moved on that way. If there was anything of a sense of future in their thought, it would be maybe like a woman expecting a baby, something to look forward to in time. But by and far, sort of like this. It just was same old, same old, same old, over and over and over. With that in mind, in our gospel text today, maybe that's what Simon Peter was against. He's thinking in his own mind, here in the now, and what is Jesus saying? This doesn't make sense. I mean, we've given up everything to follow him, and now he tells us this is the route it's going to take. Then it's going to be all over, and we're right back where we started from again anyway, cyclic over and over. Maybe Simon Peter didn't want to suffer. I mean, would you put yourself forward and say, hey, I'm going to go in there and suffer? I don't think so. However, in dynamic moments of great need, people do risk their lives for the sake of others. This is true. And so Jesus, not only for the moment, was going to be giving his life for others, but for all time into a future, which was not something they could grasp. Well, after Jesus got apparently a little worked up about this, and he says something very damning that we just don't expect to hear from Jesus. When Jesus is using in context here, Satan, it's representing what is contrary to the will of God. So when Jesus addresses, you are Satan, you are not thinking as God thinks. You're thinking as a human being. You become an obstacle, as the gospel puts it. You're not tuning in. You're not paying attention to what God is asking of us, but you just want the good old days. And it's not always going to be that way. Jeremiah, again, maybe is representing the reality that things are not always going to go well. We may have very difficult times trying to figure out a relationship where things are going very awkward in a marriage or in a family, in a community, in a parish, in a nation. And it may be very hard to know how to resolve it. And those things are going to be cyclical, really, as we know, because they kind of keep coming back. Even though we may make some progress along the way in things, some things just are very difficult to eradicate completely from this human existence of ours. Jesus says, if you're going to be my disciples, there's a few things you got to keep in mind. Having to deny yourself. Sounds good, but when we've got our opinion and we want to stick with it, we will do whatever we have to prove our point, gritting teeth. But Jesus says at times you're just going to have to accept defeat. going to have to accept the fact that you're wrong. And someone else may have a better answer. Over the years, especially as a pastor in parishes, there's some decisions I made which I wish I didn't. One parish council situation comes to mind. In one parish I was at, I would always be the last to speak about an issue, and this was a very sensitive issue. And the council at large agreed to go in this direction. And I was getting more and more uncomfortable because what they were wanting to do was really contrary to church teaching in the gospel. So I swallowed hard as I could and put out why I could not support this, and I would veto it unless you think it over and realize why I'm saying what I'm saying. So I was a little bit scared about it, not knowing where it was going to go. But they did revisit it, taking into account the things I said, apparently trusting the words I was saying, and they accepted it. Got through that one. But again, there were some other decisions, things that I may have done inadvertently, not meaning to hurt someone, where you need to ask forgiveness. But the more difficult ones are where you have to confront someone face to face and say no, or it must be this way, it cannot be that way. And you're not always going to get everybody to agree with you. Am I right? And with God's grace and God's Spirit, hopefully we can accept each other's weaknesses, but each other's strengths, and move on. Something that comes to mind is thinking that going through life and trying to make right choices and live faithfully and all that would be like, think of the three major interchanges in Milwaukee. The Mitchell near the airport, downtown the Marquette, one out toward the zoo. Now, these magnificent roadways with all the turns and curves and overpasses, underpasses, this and that. Well, somebody was pretty smart. They said, if we just build this thing and say, okay, now go drive through it, no one's going to know what to do because you don't know where it's taking you. Well, they put signs up. And so you're warned ahead of time, and then arrows overhead. Even then, people are going like this, as you've seen. But those signs then guide us through what could be a terrible maze. I'm thinking that's maybe the way life is. We don't just go through life, but we look for the signs, the Word of God, the encouragement from someone, and all of those kind of signs which then will guide us in our own needs, in our responsibilities of living life. It's said that Jesus might have thought of Jeremiah as kind of his role model, realizing that Jeremiah had some terrible times in his role as the prophet, and that Jesus would have noticed that that's likely going to happen in his life based upon how things were going. It would make some sense. And Jeremiah ultimately didn't give up. And Jesus, facing the reality of the difficulties that were there, he wasn't going to give up, thanks be to God, but does again remind us if we're going to be disciples, we're going to have to deny ourselves. So it's not belittling ourselves, it's just not grasping for stuff and hanging on to it because it's mine, but being willing to be generous and share life generously with others. Pick up your cross. That's a difficult one too, because the cross could be an illness, diabetes, the coronavirus and how it can affect the community, mental issues, Alzheimer's, the kinds of things that can plague us for which we don't know where to go except to pick up the cross and bear it. And know that even though it's painful and difficult to handle and deal with, like the way of the cross, others are there to accompany us in that particular journey of carrying a cross. We're not alone in it if we allow people in as much as we are willing to offer our support and help, taking up your cross. Difficult, but critical and essential if one is to be a disciple. And Jesus says, then you can follow me. So in the end here, what we may have to do is visit the obstacles in our lives. What are our obstacles? Or it's going to be different for all of us. It could be our temper. It could be our attitude about stuff. It could be prejudice. It could be who knows what all. There's so many possibilities of stumbling blocks, of boulders that interrupt our journey, if we call it that, through those interchanges. But once we deny ourselves, pick up the cross, we're going to understand better through prayer, reflection, what it means to be a faithful disciple. Finally, Paul sometimes really has a gem to say to us. Some of his sentences are so complicated, you don't know where he's going. But because our second reading today was so short, it's really a perfect response, I think, to our gospel today. He says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies, your whole life, and everything connected to that life of ours, as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. Do not conform yourselves to this age. Well, that's a powerful one. But be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. So my fellow disciples, Jesus does remind us, deny yourself, pick up the cross, and follow his lead.